What could this be all about? Stacy?
Max, you know, you call timber when the big tree you're cutting down is about to fall, and you warn everybody that things are falling apart in the woods. And I think you could say the same thing about all this money printing and the monetary policy amidst a pandemic where supply chains are shut down as well. And we see the impact on mega inflation starting to happen. $1,610 is what lumber prices soared to. So here's the CME contract. Look at that. Look at that going parabolic, Max. Yeah, this is, of course, hitting the housing market in the United States as everybody flees the cities and makes for the countryside. And as we've pointed out before, of course, there's a moratorium on kicking anybody out, you know, renters who have failed to pay their rent for the past year, or mortgage holders who have failed to pay their mortgages, as most mortgages are backed by the government, essentially. So there's a moratorium on that. And therefore, there's a supply shortage. On top of that, the pandemic has a supply shortage on workers. So here we have lumber prices going parabolic on the markets.
Right. So let's wrap our minds around this. We've been saying now for years that all this money printing would cause inflation, but we didn't really see it at the level of the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And, well, because the CPI doesn't reflect the actual prices of stuff that people use. They typically quote prices of stuff that people don't use, and they don't include housing or healthcare or education, for example. And that worked for a while, but now it's really hard to hide the fact that the money printing is causing a lot of inflation, as you would expect. So now the big question is, do we take the word of the central bank, who is saying that it's transitory and that this is a sugar high and that things are not going to last in this way? Or do we think that this might be a structural beginning of an inflationary period, possibly a period of stagflation because the economy could be stagnant? Or is it what Bitcoin is telling us, that the US dollar has been in a hyperinflationary collapse against Bitcoin? I think when you look at the bond market, which is a proxy of which way inflation's going, if you've had a 40-year bull market in bonds, which has told us that inflation is quiet, and I think the bond market is turning. So I think we're entering a secular bond bear market, which would indicate we're in a secular period of inflation.
The entire real world of all the commodities are spiking. In terms of these house price costs, Wolf Richter, he speaks to a builder in the Midwest somewhere, and this builder mentions that 3-inch PVC pipes, which are obviously crucial to the plumbing system in the house, he was able to secure those at 12 cents per 3-inch back in the autumn. They now go for $5 so per foot. So, you know, a huge increase in the price of these PVC pipes. But he mentions, again, like the builders are willing to pay it, the developers are willing to pay that, and the consumer, that buyers all along the chain are willing to pay those prices, he says, shows that there is a massive shift in the mindset. What would have caused a buyer's strike in past years is now causing a buyer's frenzy. So the price going up, you see this in inflations or hyperinflations, a frenzy of buying because you want to get it before it goes even higher. So that's what you're starting to see. That mindset is the psychological impact across an entire economy is obviously what the Fed spends a lot of time trying to manage that. That's what Fed speak is all about, is trying to manage the psychology of the market participants.
Right, so this looks like it's shaping up to be an inflationary depression.
Yes.
Like we've seen in Weimar Germany or Venezuela or Zimbabwe, versus what we saw in the 1930s in the US, a deflationary depression. So this would be an inflationary depression, and people are panic buying assets right now to protect themselves against what looks like an event on the horizon, which would be an utter collapse of the US dollar.
Of course, in charge of the US dollar is the Treasury. The Treasury tries to stay quiet and let the Fed, which only has power over credit, it can't print US dollars, so it lets the Fed do all the, be the puppet, like this kind of spokesperson that's always speaking up the dollar or whatever. But Yellen, of course, Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary now, used to be the Fed chairman. Well, she's now, she set off a panic by saying, we could raise rates if interest rates get too high. Of course, that's not the remit of the Treasury at the moment, but it caused panic. Is this what they're thinking? Is this what's going to happen? And just the fact that it's not like prices going parabolic like that isn't telling people already that there's inflation. Like, why are they getting panicked? Because the Treasury Secretary points out what is obvious. She's obviously watching Keiser Report.
Right. Well, if I recall my Dostoevsky, the book Death of Ivan Ilyich, it's an interesting parable about a man who witnessed his dead, but he's can hear the mourners talking about him and his life.
That would be interesting.
Yeah. So here, the economy died in 2008, the global financial crisis, and we just haven't buried it yet. So like Ivan Ilyich, he hasn't been buried yet, and he can still hear what people are saying about him. So we can still hear people talking about the economy, like Janet Yellen and Jay Powell, even though technically it's dead. And I apologize if that's not a Dostoevsky story, but it's definitely one of the 2 or 3 most famous writers. But nevertheless, the analogy holds, even though some names may have been incorrect.
Well, Max, I believe you have that wrong. It was Tolstoy, right?
Oh, right. I always get those two mixed up.
Yeah, it happens, Great writers all get confused with each other. But again, getting mixed up, of course, people can't tell if there's inflation or deflation. Again, like we've been in a whirlwind of chaos since 2008. And for that entire time, nobody knows whether we're going up or down, whether there's deflation or inflation. The fact that, for example, incomes are up over 20% in the past year, stock markets hitting all-time highs. Of course, now there's some tumbling in the NASDAQ and stuff, but like that reads like boom times, but the government policies are like Great Depression level stuff. Like everybody's applauding Biden as being like FDR, and you're like, but like markets are at all-time highs, and incomes are up. So like, what's going on?
He is the FDR for bankers, right? Quantitative easing is the same as what we did in the 30s under FDR's work relief programs. He helped people get jobs and he injected them with money, right? So Biden's like, these poor bankers, they're not going to get their bonuses this year. Some of them are defaulting on their yacht payments. What can I do? I know, I'll send them another $1 trillion.
Yeah, well, the Fed is obviously doing the quantitative easing, which is an easing of credit and taking all the bad debts and putting it on the Fed's balance sheet. Biden is presiding over the Treasury and Janet Yellen, who are speaking to a debt economy, and they're printing up actual Treasury bills, actual money, layer one base money. They're printing it all up and throwing it at anybody. Of course, the way our economy is set up, you can't get it to the people. You have to give it to bankers first. They want to cut, and then they'll agree to it.
Right, it's distributed by the same guys, So
yes.
Whether it's base money being printed or credit being expanded, it all roads lead through the narrow passage called Jamie Dimon's bank.
And actually, speaking of that, I want to point out something that I've been thinking, is that, quantitative easing started in 2008 in America. It started earlier in Japan, but it started in America. And as you said, like, it's the Fed issuing credit and swapping all the bad debts, taking the bad debts off the balance sheets of the private banks and putting it on the balance sheet of the Fed, which ultimately the taxpayer, the American population, underwrites, whether or not they understand that. But so the quantitative easing caused that cantillon effect, caused that huge wealth gap that happened, right? So now you have fiscal stimulus for the first time. This hasn't been seen ever in our lifetimes. Like we've never, I think, Max, you said you once received a $600 stimulus check.
Yes, I did, under Reagan.
Under Reagan. I've never received any of them, but these are just like mammoth size. So I'm feeling like, now we're in the next phase of that. Like we had a domestic cantillon effect. Now we have a global one starting to happen, right? So all Americans are getting huge thousands of dollars of checks, trillions collectively. And that's causing a cantillon effect globally, right? Because now they're closer to that fresh printed cash versus somebody in Bolivia or Mexico or Europe or anywhere else. Like this flood of cash is coming in here first. So you're going to have a Cantillon effect. But, you know, if this is inflationary and the Great Depression was deflationary, what you saw was that game theory going on a, you know, geopolitical level of like, you're trying to beggar thy neighbor, like push deflation onto them. Like Britain was the first to pull themselves off the gold standard. They boomed, and then at the expense of others. So I think you're starting to see that. You're seeing that in the commodities prices. You're seeing that in the headlines about inflation. Iron ore, steel hit all-time highs as monster commodity rally breaks records. It goes on to talk about all these iron ore prices, steel, and all that stuff. And it has a lot to do with this like game theory and the trade wars going on between the US and China and what's going on there.
Right. The money printing is causing a global Cantillon effect because the Americans are taking that check, that money, and they're buying goods from China.
Yeah.
Right, so they get China has a surge, and then they have an export surge. So this is resulting in deglobalization. Remember in January, we said the three major trends for 2021 would be deglobalization, de-dollarization, and depopulation. So this is de-dollarization and deglobalization, and we see this even happening post-Brexit now. I see that Britain and France are at each other's throats over fishing rights and actually coming to blows. So this is all happening in a deglobalized context.
And that deglobalization back, leading up to the Great Depression, that was like a crackdown collapse, a crackdown depression. This is a crack up depression. It's a crack up deflation, a deglobalization process.
Right, because they let the bonds collapse in the depression of the 1930s. You had banks go bankrupt, and you had bond markets collapse. And that was deflationary, and you had a deflationary depression. Here, since Bernanke and Greenspan, you have constant bailing out of the banks with all this crazy money. So there was never the natural process of getting rid of the bad banks. All they did was they kept the zombie banks alive. And now this has led to an inflationary depression.
And of course, back in 1933, they were able to seize the citizens' gold. The American citizens had savings. Now they don't, right? So all they have are checks signed by Biden with a letter from Biden. So it's like you have to go seeking it elsewhere, and that you can beggar thy neighbor with the inflation or the hyperinflation.
Right, which is leading to conflicts.
Yep.
Trade war, currency war, hot war.
And I'll show you this. Iron ore prices hit all-time high $200 a ton. That's the first time. And that's part of the crack up. Timber!
I'm a lumberjack, not. Oh, wait a minute. Hey, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Aleks Svetski. He is the founder of Amber App. He's out with a new piece entitled Fiat, Fascism and Communism. So we wanted to get him right on. Let's start with fiat collectivism, Aleks. How does fiat lead to collectivism? Give us some examples of this collectivism, Aleks.
Max, thanks for having me back on. Fiat collectivism, I guess, the idea that somebody has the capacity to create the object or the mechanism with which we measure the product, the product of our labor as human beings, that they then have the ability to play a game of heads I win, tails you lose. And whatever action they take, if it's a good action and they make, a good decision, they get to sort of privatize their gains. And if they make a bad one, they get to socialize the losses by creating more of this thing called money. And then sort of we pay for everything. So it creates like a really unfair game. And it is the basis upon which all collectivism is based. Like collectivism, this idea of whether it's communism, fascism, democracy, whatever other ism they, want to place these days, it requires some sort of institution to keep itself in business. And the way it keeps itself in business is by stealing from us. And fiat enables that whole thing. It's crazy.
Right. I see where you're going with that. Now, it happened over time, right? Because it's a slow process. People aren't aware of it. What you're saying, people will say, I hadn't thought of it like that. What do people think that they're getting with fiat money?
Well, I mean, when you ask an old person what's money, they're like, oh, it's this thing that the government issues. So they assume that it's like some sort of mechanism. And most people, they try and define money as just like a medium of exchange. So they sort of know that the money itself doesn't have any value, but they think it's just sort of this tool. So I don't really know what it is that people think they're getting. They're just sort of, I think they're just asleep and ignorant to it. I don't think they even question what they're getting. And as a result, they sort of, sheep to the slaughter in a sense.
Right, and a few other ideas here. So there's this Cantillon effect, which is a sort of a collectivism. It's really a new deal for bankers, if you think about it. Like you were saying, they have the ability to bail out their friends. And with the fiat money, and to be able to print fiat money, and what we've seen is that no banking fraud goes without a bailout. And this goes on over and over again. And they also get to write the laws, right? So if you have a lot of fiat, you can go down to Washington, you can buy a senator, buy a congressman, have some laws written to, we see this all the time. For example, the merger of Citigroup and Travelers Corporation was patently against the Glass-Steagall law. But they did it anyway, knowing that post-merger, they were going to change the law. And that is really the law of the land, is there is no law. So we have a destabilization of society in places like the U.S., where partisanship is erupted between the so-called winners and the deplorables. That's interesting, is that in America, it's not really Republicans and Democrats anymore. It's the people who got away with stealing the money, the so-called winners, versus the victims of these financial crimes, which are the deplorables. So let's address the elephant in the room, Bitcoin. So does Bitcoin fix this? And if so, how, Aleks?
It 100% does. I actually want to say, you mentioned, the bankers, and I would argue that it's not necessarily that the bankers are bad, but it's that the system is set up in a way that the bankers become bad. When there exists a monopoly like the state, game theoretically speaking, it's logical to go and coerce the state to create laws and regulations and rules and a monopoly that enables you to have, an unfair advantage. So that's sort of the crux of the game there, is in the absence of the state, actually, you end up getting competitive banking, which is a good thing. I don't see nothing wrong with competitive banking, if you have people playing on the same playing field. And this is what Bitcoin fixes. It says, all right, let's rip money as the most important tool for human society. Let's rip that out of the hands of everyone. The state, the bankers, everyone. Let's just put it out here, and it's a set of rules. It's not an institution governed by rulers, but it's a network governed by a set of rules that are voluntary, and everyone can opt in. And on that thing, anyone can build their own bank. They can build their own financial service. They can build their own, community. They can do whatever they want, but they can't skew the rules in favor of themselves at the expense of everyone else. So this is sort of in my article, I say Bitcoin is the only possibility we have, or it's the closest thing possible to a true equality of opportunity. Because everyone sort of talks about, equality of outcome is bad, equality of opportunity is great. And then they're like, that's sort of where the conversation stops, because realistically, you can't get equality of opportunity unless we sort of blow the whole planet up and start everyone from scratch again. We all live in different places at different points in time, with different families, with different opportunities, with different resources, with a different social, all of that is always going to be, different across the board. So we can't have equality of opportunity in anything other than if we can get equality of opportunity through the mechanism that we, store the product of our labor and exchange it through money. You create what's really, really important, which is social mobility. And this is something that I don't hear anybody talking about. I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson's work, for example. And he's always talking about, inequality is a real problem because, when someone creates wealth, you get this sort of 80-20 distribution where the more wealth you create, the more you get. But what they miss is the dynamic nature of a system in which you can't socialize your losses. So this is what Bitcoin gives us, is it makes anyone who's at the top, who's managed to make a bunch of good decisions to climb, there is a risk of falling if you make bad decisions. And anyone who's at the bottom, if they decide to make good decisions or if they make prudent, actions, they can actually climb. In the current system, you can't do that. If you're at the top, you can artificially stay there through being close to the monetary spigot. And if you're at the bottom, you can't get ahead, because as fast as you run, the thing that you're saving, the wealth that you're saving is evaporating faster than you're saving it. So you can't get away. So instead of getting a natural 80-20 sort of equilibrium in terms of inequality, which is natural, you see it in nature, you see it in music, you see it in sports, you see it in wealth, you see it in brains, you see it in everything. Instead of getting a natural inequality, you get an unnatural inequality. You get a 99.9 to a 0.1, which is what you said about the deplorables and the rest of us. So Bitcoin fixes all of that, because we have a game that we're all playing. It's the same rules.
So that's a question I hear all the time. Will Bitcoin simply replicate the system as we know it today, because they see now people in the corporations and others getting billions of dollars of Bitcoin, and that's one of the instincts or thoughts that people have. But what you're saying is, in fact, it doesn't replicate the system as we know it, because no matter how much Bitcoin you have, you cannot change the rules. You cannot change the system. You don't influence the system. Everyone is equal in that sense, and that's very different. Of course, you said that you can't wholesale change the system without really starting from scratch. With Bitcoin, you are kind of starting from scratch, but we will see wholesale changes because we will see wealth kind of redistributed, for lack of a better word. But we're going to see a whole christening of the entire economy, and there will be people who will be impacted quite severely, because the whole system is changing. But that's the way revolutions happen. Now, since we spoke to you last, Aleks, there's been kind of a new thing in that, we talk about the Cantillon effect, and of course that's quantitative easing, and it's benefited the top 1% in the ways that we've discussed. But in the past year, we've seen an extraordinary fiscal stimulus. So the ordinary American is getting now 20% more in income. Incomes are absolutely skyrocketing, and it's all printed money. It's coming from the government. And but what's the problem with this?
There's heaps of problems with it. I guess, are you talking more about the handouts, or are you talking about people's wages or salaries increasing somewhat?
I'm talking not about wages. I'm talking about the transfer payments from the government in the form of the extraordinary checks that the government's sending out. It's not coming from quantitative easing as you would from the Fed. It's actually money printing. They're getting a check from the government. And as such, 34% of the average American income now is coming directly from just a check being sent to them from the government. And so this is kind of a new thing since we spoke to you last.
Insane.
So it's QE for the people, if you will. Is that better?
Look, I don't know if it's better or worse. Like me and Brady have spoken about this. So this is Bitcoin, and he thinks it's a good thing. I err on the side of a bad thing, because I believe human beings exist and persist on the basis of having a mission, something to do in life. And for a lot of people, that sort of mission manifests in sort of their career and something they're driving and striving towards. So what you do by just handing out money to people is it's the classic adage. It's, you teach a man to fish, or you just give them a fish. Like, what are we doing? We're just giving them fish, and people are becoming lazy slobs who don't have, something to drive towards. Like, for a human being to grow, you need some sort of pressure. Now, what this does is it relaxes the pressure, and it creates lazy human beings that are sludge. Like, it reminds me of the movie WALL-E, where that sort of Disney pick with the little robot, and everyone at the end is just sitting on those chairs and floating around, just watching a screen and sucking nutrients out of a straw. So you got that part. But what it also does, it creates a nation of dependence. Like, and that's probably the more insidious component of it, is that you've got people who are sort of lazy, and they have no will to live anymore. So you've got that sort of nihilistic element, and nothing to sort of push up against, nothing to strive for. But then you've also got this dependence, which reinforces the existence of the state, and reinforces the state's kind of position as the nanny, or the mother, or the father, the one who is in charge of making all decisions for everyone else. So I think it's super, 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 super dangerous. Like, at least, with the, traditional Cantillon effect, at least we all can together get off at the banks or the state. We can say, look, there's a blatant ripoff here. We've sort of got some energy and something to focus at like this, you sort of dismantle that focus. So I would actually err towards it being there being much worse ramifications to just handing out money to everyone.
Oh, all right. Well, we're going to have to continue this for another segment because your insights are brilliant as usual, and your writing is you put out a piece here that's got the internet electrified. So I'm going to wrap this up, but we're going to carry over for another segment. Thanks for being on this segment of the Keiser Report, Aleks Svetski.
Thank you, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Aleks Svetski. He's the founder of Amber App. Until next time, bye, y'all.